pause on increases until we got the study, and now we have the study, and it said, boy, we're tremendously underfunding, and then not to follow up on that. So I appreciate that with COVID that it's been challenging, but we do need to be sure we keep on track on that, and then also, if necessary, update any information we have on the rate study. It's not that old yet, but it is important that we try to continue to follow up and ask for progress on trying to achieve some appropriate payment as we tried to do through that rate study. So, and I also want to express my opposition to the forced furloughs, which I'm glad to know that we're suspending for this year, but I think we should just end it altogether. That's enough, and if we decide that's something we need to do, then let's consciously make that decision, but let's not put it on autopilot. That's something that will happen in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, moving on to issue number 4, Self-Determination Program Implementation Update. We have the department and then Aaron Carruthers, I believe. Mr. Winfield, are you back with us?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
We can.
Thank you. I'll be providing a response to the questions on page 15 of the agenda regarding the self-determination program. As of February 19th, there were 499 regional center consumers who have transitioned into the self-determination program. Regional centers report to the department monthly on milestones that have been reached by the individuals who are transitioning into the program and those individuals who have fully transitioned. And while the data shows an upward trend in the number of selected participants that have completed their transition to the program, by comparison, if you look at the beginning of 2020, there were just over 100 participants who had started their services through self-determination. So we have seen quite an increase over the past year. It's hard to tell what effect COVID has had on transition into the self-determination program. We have heard anecdotally that the flexibility that it affords individuals has hastened their transitioning into the program. We also have heard that the department's directive waiving the financial management services fees from the person's budget has also been helpful to participants. But we've also heard from folks saying that during the pandemic, either the individual or the family just wasn't ready to transition during this time. And so it's something that we're continuing to certainly monitor and work closely with the regional centers on. So even though it has increased over the past 12 months, there's still a lot of improvements that we can make as a state agency and with our partners. In August, the statewide Self-Determination Advisory Committee submitted a letter of recommendations for improvement, some of which have been implemented already. We also have brought in a consultant, Catherine Blakemore, who is very familiar with the program and who has been assisting us. And we also are receiving technical assistance from the National Association of State Developmental Disability Services Directors and applied self-direction on ways to remove some of the barriers so that we can open the program up. We look forward to the continued partnerships with this statewide advisory group so that we can implement the plan that's referenced in the governor's budget with specific steps and strategies to achieve the goals of the self-determination program. And with everyone involved, we intend to develop a plan that supports broader and effective implementation of the self-determination program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carruthers.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senators. Aaron Carruthers with the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. The State Council was a co-sponsor of the original self-determination legislation. And we have many roles in helping make this program a success. Two of those roles include oversight roles. We convene a statewide body of the chairs of each of the regional centers' local self-determination advisory committees, which Mr. Winfield discussed. We're also to evaluate the program and report to the legislature on participant satisfaction and implementation. So from the numbers on page 16 in your committee packet and those reported by Mr. Winfield, implementation is slow. especially slow during this initial phase-in period. Of the 3,300 names that have been drawn for 2,500 slots, 499 people have fully transitioned from the traditional regional center service program into the self-determination program. So after almost 3 years, that's about 20%. The question that's on my mind is whether this slow rate is a sign of something wrong with the program, or is it just the pace of implementation? I've looked at it from many angles, and my conclusion is that the slow pace is a matter of implementation. The good news is there's many places and ways to improve on implementation. First, I want to acknowledge the delays caused by COVID. Director Bargeman, Mr. Winfield, DDS leadership, regional centers, service coordinators, families, people with IDD, everyone throughout this process have all been showing great leadership to just advance this program despite the incredible barriers the pandemic posed. Beyond COVID, in August of 2020, Mr. Winfield mentioned the statewide Self-Determination Advisory Committee produced a barriers report on the self-determination program and identified 4 main barriers and got into solutions for those barriers. And we've provided that report and those recommendations to this committee. I also think that the DDS data that's in the agenda is very helpful because it helps us look at where breakdowns may be happening and come up with targeted remedies. We can see at who has completed each step of the process, and we can see it by regional center. The data shows there's a drop-off between steps 1 and steps 2. 85% of people have completed the first step, but only 28 have finished the second step. So we can look at and think what's happening there in that process and come up with target remedies for each step of the process. So some solutions include setting benchmarks for the different data points that are the department's tracking and reporting on. As I mentioned, is it good enough that 85% of people had finished the first step? Is it bad that only 28% have finished the second step at this point in the process? Or is that just the natural part and flow of this process? Benchmarks will set up reasonable expectations for everybody involved to know what it's going to take to get across the finish line. Also, another solution is each regional center should set a goal for how many people it can enroll in the next 6 months. Just set a stretch goal and then accomplish it. Another recommendation is there should be a commitment to enroll all families who are members of local self-determination advisory committees into the program by June. They are very engaged in the program, the most motivated, and they should be in. Lastly, there's one barrier that doesn't show up in the data. The phase-in period itself has created its own barrier to the program. The system, everybody involved, their time, their thoughts, their solutions are all going into managing how to implement the 3-year phase-in process. So it's already law that this period ends in June 2021. It should expand statewide, then without change. That way the system can shift its focus to other aspects of making this program successful. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Pettit, LAO.
Hi, Madam Chair. Thank you, Sonia Pettit, LAO. We just have a couple comments on this particular item. So, and really it's that we have a couple of concerns. So the first concerns the rollout and plan for expanding the program in July. As Mr. Carruthers just noted, statute required a 3-year phase-in period after the time that the department received approval from the federal government to secure federal funding for the program. That 3 years ends this summer, and it's unclear. And at that point, statute says that the program should be made available to any consumer who is interested in it, provided they go through the proper informational sessions, et cetera. So we have just some concerns about whether that's realistic to think that the department will be ready to roll it out to anybody statewide who is interested in the program. Our second concern is primarily fiscal. So statute requires that the self-determination program be budget neutral. And the way that it's working is that the individual budget for each consumer is based on the previous year's spending on that consumer. At least 2 considerations can be allowed, however. So for one, if somebody's new to the system and didn't have spending in the previous year, obviously a new budget has to be developed. Secondly, if an individual had some amount of unmet need in the previous year that can be accounted for. What we've been hearing from some regional centers as well as from the department itself is that costs are coming in higher for individuals than in previous years. And this could really mean a couple of things. First, it could mean that consumers were not getting everything that they needed in previous years, and this is sort of making up for that in the self-determination program. Could also mean that services that are provided outside of the traditional DDS network or outside of the traditional DDS service provider network could cost more. And that in turn could be a reflection of the rate challenges that we've already heard discussed at today's hearing. We suggest that the legislature request more information from the department about the individual budgeting process in the self-determination program. And this should include data on costs and authorized services both before and after individuals began the self-determination program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Department of Finance?
Stephen Powell, Department of Finance. Nothing to add.
Okay. And if it's, so we've been trying to implement this for 3 years, and again, I don't have the historical perspective, but is it a valuable service that we want to maintain? And I'm assuming step one is the orientation and the getting in, and the step two is choosing services and implementing those. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if people are doing step one and then not going into step two, is it, right? I mean, if people don't go to a restaurant after a while, we don't just keeping it open. We close the restaurant and decide that's not what people want to eat.
Madam Chair, this is Nancy Bargeman from the department, Director of the Department of Developmental Services. If I may respond to your question. The self-determination program is a program that has been desired by our community and our families. It is a different type of a program in the sense that it provides choice and flexibility and responsibility on behalf of the individual who is choosing to participate in self-determination versus traditional regional center services. And we have found over the years, when we have introduced new programs in our system, that there has been times where it's taken a number of years, unfortunately, but a number of years to be able to build the structure, to be able to build the policies and implementation. And certainly we have found challenges within the self-determination program. But it is definitely a program that is desired by our community, and one that we as a department remain committed in identifying the barriers and but also addressing, as Ms. Pettick had noted, looking at the cost prior to somebody who is participating, after somebody's who is engaged in self-determination, and the drivers that are impacting kind of those fiscal elements once we are able to get further visibility into it. We have a technical assistance from the federal government, from CMS, to assist us in reviewing our current program. And we are looking at developing a plan for going forward that we anticipate and will have available this spring to be able to have further discussions about. I hope that helps provide a little bit of clarity regarding the program and kind of some of the kind of high level struggles and implementation.
And I've heard again just repeatedly through this hearing, you know, we think anecdotally, how much good data are we collecting on again, if we're talking about benchmarks, if we're talking about outcomes, if we're talking about barriers, what kind of data tools are we using to actually get relative data and then using it?
Yeah, thank you. For self-determination, as Mr. Winfield had noted, and same with LAO and Mr. Carruthers, is that the individuals who are now the 450 plus individuals that have what's called a spending plan, that is by definition for us are those individuals that are actually having expenditures. They're spending their budget. And so in in our system, we have two things that we can access for measure. One is what is the utilization of expenditures? So I am receiving services from the regional center in respite and, day services, and my total expenditures are X. However, I had authorized services of Y. So I may have had more services authorized that I've been able to spend. And there's various reasons for that. And that's where we want to make sure that when we're comparing before the self-determination program, those services that are authorized, those that have been expended before, and then those individual budgets that families have under self-determination. And then it's so early on right now that while we know how much is authorized before self-determination, we know how much is expended before self-determination. And for those 400 and some individuals, we know what their budgets are for their spending plan. What we don't have, because we don't have enough time in the program, is how much they're spending, those expenditures. So we do have, in this particular case, and while we have many challenges in our data, this is in one of those areas that we do have access to the information. We just don't have enough experience or time in the program that's going to be able to give us that kind of assessment at this time, but we are tracking to be able to get that.
Madam Chair, Aaron Carruthers from the State Council, if I can add and amplify to Director Bargeman's comments, yes, this program is very much in demand and wanted by the community. The first measure actually speaks to that. It is, after you've had your orientation, do you still want to go on and continue in the program? 85% have said yes. So speaking directly to your question about demand, I'd also agree with Director Bargeman's comment that with 20% of the people through the program, it's not quite a representative sample as to what the expenditures will be and whether or not the LAO concerns can be supported by that information.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Pan?
Thanks very much. So I'm looking through some of the information presented. So first of all, if someone is going through self-determination, at what point, for example, of the 447 people who actually have a plan and have expenditure, if they decide that this isn't working for them, can they get back out again?
Yes, regional center consumers can opt out of self-determination if they want to go back to traditional service
at any time, right?
At any time.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Okay, that's helpful to know. And then the other question is that it said the amount of the budget, the amount of money to budget, you said is based on the previous, I guess, the previous year before you decide to enter into self-determination. Now, while certainly some developmental disabilities may be fairly stable over time, certainly circumstances may change, and sometimes some of the developmental disabilities may not be so stable, depending on the nature of the disability. Is there an intention that there are adjustments will be made for those things over time? Or I know we're still kind of new, or is it a fixed budget? I mean, how fixed is this budget over time? And how does it take account of changing circumstances for that particular individual?
Yeah, so the self-determination program is similar to traditional case management in that the planning team comes up with a plan, and it's per that plan that the budget is determined, and then the spending plan is derived from that budget. So the planning team looks at the prior 12 months of expenditures, and then they consider any unmet needs that individual might have, and then that helps to determine what is in the IPP, and thus the budget and the spending.
Okay, so if someone was in the self-determination plan, they had a budget for 1 year, and then they made certain choices. The planning team will look at that and then decide next year's budget, or they'll look at a hypothetical set of services that person, obviously because they're in self-determination, perhaps did or did not decide to purchase. And so I'm just wondering, like, what does the team look at if someone's actually in the self-determination program? are they actually looking at what they actually chose to spend in their budget, or are they looking at a hypothetical plan for someone of this similar circumstances?
No, it's based on that individual and their needs, and
Uh-huh.
those needs can be revisited at any time.
Okay, so in other words, the planning team could make an adjustment to the budget based on those.
Correct.
Okay, all right. And then I guess the other question is that, so I guess, is it, well, coming soon, we're supposed to branch this out to everyone, and I appreciate that the comment was made that it seems to be popular because 85% of people after getting oriented chose to, but at the same time, I would make note that we haven't hit the 2,500, right? Well, I mean, we've had spaces, we've had 3,326 people selected, but then 1172 withdrew, so we're net continuing participation only 2154, of which only 447 are continuing. So I'm not saying that people don't want this, but is there a thought that perhaps we haven't really even been able to fill up the pilot in some ways, the initial 2,500. So is the plan to still to continue the pilot to get more data, or we're running up against a point where we're saying, oh, now we're just going to open it up to everyone, but do we really know enough about this since we can't even get the pilot to be completely filled?
Yeah, Dr. Pan, this is Nancy Bargeman.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd like to make note of is that we are evaluating what our kind of plan for rollout, like I had said, that we find that it's going to be important for us to have a pretty comprehensive kind of plan and approach to next steps to address the barriers that have been discussed, but then also to identify, what additional guardrails, if any, are needed. Some examples of that has to do with, how are we approaching, there's a use in self-determination. The only vendored service in self-determination is the financial management service. And as we look at some of the barriers, some of it is centered around kind of how we've approached our structure in financial management services. So we need to take a look at how we're going to be able to move that forward. So to your point, as far as are we going to use more information to help inform us? And I think we can do that. We're going to, as noted, we have more than doubled the number of participants that have moved past orientation, past having their budget set to their spending plan. So we have more individuals in that milestone at the later stages than we did earlier on. I will share with you that nationally, there's most states who have a self-determination program, and we're learning more about that. Average about 10 to 15% of those who are within their waivers actually opt to participate in a self-determination program. And I'm not saying that that's a cap that we would want to achieve too, but I think it gives us a little bit of visibility into what other states have experienced when they've had the broader door open for more participants beyond what we've identified in our first 3 years of the pilot I shouldn't use the term pilot, the fade in of the 2,500 versus having it open to our broader community.
Okay, so I guess what I'm not hearing is the answer to the question, which is that do you plan to continue? Well, I guess you'll tell. Hopefully by May you'll be telling, because there's a statutory deadline, right, to talk about opening it up or not. Are you planning to continue the pilot, which by the way still has slots, so it's not that we're denying anyone who wants to do it. Are we saying that we actually know enough to completely open it up? And then also, since you mentioned 10 to 15%, and I'm trying to remember so we have a pilot of 2,500, which we haven't filled up. If we were actually at 10% or 15%, how many people would that be given who you're serving now in DDS? So, 2,500 represents what percentage?
Yeah, and to answer your question, I'm going to continue to say is that that's correct. Our plan, we do plan on having an outline of kind of those steps going forward. You know, and I do want to clarify because I misused the word pilot. This is not a pilot.
Okay.
And so, you know, it is our intent to be able to have the self-determination program open to our broader community. We have some things to work through. And before I can say that, you know, everything is going to be on track to have a very broad opening, we need to think through how do we do that? How do the regional centers be able to help individuals, you know, move to self-determination? How do we make sure that some of the areas in which we need to, what I call kind of structure in the program. Now, you'll hear from our stakeholders that they're concerned that the program's not just saying, okay, we're going to go ahead and open, you know, as of June or July. And I'm not suggesting that we're not going to do that. What I'm saying is that we need to make sure that we're addressing the barriers and anything that needs to have kind of course correction in the program to really have a very successful program going forward. We want it to be successful. This is what our community is asking for. They want to be able to have choice. So as far as those next steps, you know, we have to also work through our waiver. So any changes or anything that we're doing is going to be very, very transparent and working with our families that are very dedicated and advocating for self-determination. Okay. So I ask, you know, that, you know, more to come over the spring when we've been able to work with our technical assistance teams to be able to see what modifications would benefit the program going forward and our community.
So what I'm hearing from you is there's still a lot of work to do. Certainly, I'm not suggesting we stop doing this, but also based on even on your own data and even on your own testimony right now, that there's still a lot of things to still work out. So at least, even though you're not saying this right now, I think certainly, and I appreciate your commitment to transparency, and you've always have been in my work with you, that we would like to have more of an update and what your plans are, at least in you know, for the following year, in terms of how moving this program forward and being sure that those guardrails are there. So it's, you know, certainly not opposed to doing self-determination. I think that the issue is that sounds like we haven't figured out all the guardrails yet, given the limited amount of information we have, because you know, we still don't have that many people in the pilot, or you don't want to call it pilot, but basically in it's our first cohort, right? We haven't even filled the numbers up, for that. And so I think we want to be sure we have those enough data so that we have those lessons learned. And I think certainly here, those of us here in the legislature want to be sure we're part of that conversation. So, and we want, and it's not only our role in oversight to be able to know what the plans are and what kind of guardrails are being put in place.
Yes, thank you for that. And I will make note that we are in short term looking at how do we provide opportunities for more to move, you know, through the process to, you know, increase our 450, 60 individuals quicker. And there are some short-term things that we can do to be able to address that on a short-term basis. Okay. So we're looking at short and the longer term and look forward to working with the legislature and our community on this.
Okay, and then one other piece of information, be interested in knowing the amount of overhead in terms of for the department, for people on self-determination versus if they're getting regular, so how much overhead that's associated. Obviously, we want to provide families who are in self-determination with some support. So not just like, here you go, you know, figure out yourself. You know, we want, so in terms of overhead, I'm not saying that's all bad, but just want to know what the overhead also is for the department in doing this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Pan, Aaron Carruthers from the State Council. You raised good questions regarding the amount that needs to be implemented. What I'm seeing from my point of view is that every part of the system is working together to still implement it and work through these issues. So while there's a lot to work on, I wouldn't take that as an indication or a sign of problems with the program. Regional centers, families, consumers, certainly the department's leadership is working on it. And evidence of that is how many more people have been enrolled even during COVID, with all of the demands and just life-saving aspects of the pandemic from those last year. If people weren't committed to this program, it'd be easy just to sort of walk away and not make movement on it. But there has been movement despite all odds, and I think that's good evidence to the dedication to this program.
I appreciate that. I think it's again, I'm not opposed. Actually, I think it's a good direction if that's what people want. But also in our oversight function, we want to know, what are we, as we're rolling it out, that we're doing it in a manner actually that the director just talked about, and that we have clarity for ourselves here in the legislature and oversight function, what the lessons learned, what the kind of guardrails are, the oversight expenses, the supports families need when they're doing self-determination, those types of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think we're kind of all saying the same thing. We can feel like this is a good idea, but if it's been up and running and it's not fully implemented yet, to go back to the earlier analogy, before we franchise this out, we want to make sure everybody who was in this, not pilot, but this first wave, we'll say, are being fully served in an effective manner before we say we're taking this, we're expanding this even further. Okay, I think we'll move on to now issue number 5, community navigators.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nancy Bargeman, Director of the Department of Developmental Services. For this issue 5, I will be addressing questions 1 and 2, and then Mr. Trepinka will provide responses for questions 3 and 4. I thank you for giving us the opportunity to present to you our proposal for the Community Navigator Program. This is really stemmed from actually since I started the department as director, but even before that, the priority of addressing the inequity of spending and disparities within our programs. One of the number of policies and efforts that we have in working on this issue, because we do have significant challenges facing services to underserved communities, and need to continue to keep the efforts as a priority, but also looking at new ways to be able to be responsive and disrupt this inequity of service delivery in particular areas. So part of our effort, the grant program has been in operation since 16-17, and over the years, for those who are not as familiar with it, we do have $11 million that has been approved in our budget